right. Well, welcome back to Diverse Joy, a podcast where two so-called experts bring joy back into the conversations around diversity. I'm here with my amazing and fun glasses spectacular host, Dr. Will Cox.
And I'm here with my beautiful, voluptuous, big, beautiful woman co-host, Dr. Amber Nelson.
That's right.
And if you're wondering why I'm emphasizing her body, which is not normally something I would recommend you doing without someone's consent or an understanding, as we're going to get into it, today's topic will be weight bias.
Yeah.
But before we get there, let me share some of my joy.
Yeah, what's bringing you joy?
So this time of year, in my hometown, I wasn't raised here, but I consider my hometown now, Madison, Wisconsin. There is an event that goes on every couple of weeks for about a month and a half during February and January. And it's called Camp Bingo. It's a drag bingo event that is a fundraiser for the AIDS Resource Center of Wisconsin.
That's awesome.
And for each bingo session, they have a theme. So it's kind of like a theme party. They had one that was like Under the Sea. One year they did a theme around the movie Clue, and I dressed up as Miss White, which if you know that movie and that character, she has this great scene where she's talking about this rage filling her up that led her to murder, and she's like, fire, flames on the side of my face. And so I made a costume where I had flames on the side of my face.
That. So great.
In the video version of the podcast, we'll stick a picture up. Yeah. And then, of course, one year was Star Wars bingo.
It's not like you have anything.
No. And not only did I attend, I won the costume contest.
You did. Of course you did.
With my maximal cosplay costume, dressed up as Ahsoka Tano, who's a female character in Star Wars, but I did a gender swap. So I have a cosplay where I'm a male version of her because she's like my favorite Star Wars character.
That's so cool.
But it's always fun. You know, me and my friends go have some drinks, play some bingo, and it's all for a good cause. And it's just an all-around fun time where a lot of the gay community in Madison comes together for it. And it always brings me joy, which is what I'm talking about. So what about you, Amber? What is bringing you joy right now?
So great. Well, this just reminds me of it's something I haven't done in a while, but we used to do interactive movies, and so you'd go dressed up, and we'd have like this really great time, kind of interacting with the movie. We had a host, and they would kind of call things out during the movie. It was so much fun. So the Camp Bingo kind of reminded me of that. But this is our Valentine's Day episode, or kind of like February Valentine's theme. And my favorite thing, it's a little like abstract, maybe the thing that brings me joy, but is the second day, third day after Valentine's Day, 70-80% off candy at like the drugstores specifically. Like Walgreens, CVS, they always have the best deals. And so I always like to wait like the day after Valentine's Day to get all of the candy. And I stock up for like my office because I love having candy and things on hand for my students and myself to snack on. I usually buy Valentine's Day gifts for everybody like the day or 2 days after, and like get everybody chocolates and like all of the little like Wild About You little like stuffed animals and things. And I just love it. And like my local Walgreens like knows that this is my thing, and they're like, Amber, like we still have some really good stuff. I'm like, yes. And I have to get there like just the right time where it's like 70 or 80% off while it still has good selection. So that's like one of my favorite things to do this time of year is get the cheap candy.
I can definitely see the inner Leslie Knope coming out.
Yes, exactly. Like get it all, give everybody little Valentine's Day gifts. And if I do it like the day after, then I get it on the low. So
that's so much fun.
Yes, it's so fun. It's thrifty and all of the things. So
wonderful.
Yeah.
All right. So today's topic, we're going to be talking about weight bias. And take it away. What do you have? What would you like to say about it?
Well, I think I am really glad that we're just having the conversation because, I mean, weight bias, size bias, I think is a really big thing that doesn't really get
Is
talked
that a
about.
pun?
It's a big
It's a
thing.
big thing.
On a lot of ways, though, it can go both ends of the spectrum
Oh,
to like
absolutely.
bias towards, folks that occupy smaller bodies too, and then those that occupy larger bodies. And I think there are lots of terms, right,
Yeah.
around those who occupy larger bodies, and I think that within the community, we're reclaiming the word fat, right? Like
Right.
identifying, self-identifying as fat. Like there doesn't have to be any judgment value on the word fat. It's just descriptive, right? It's just
Yep.
is, just like saying my shoes are black and my dress is red, clouds are fluffy, right? It's just a statement of fact, and that we don't have to place values on it. And that really, when we talk about weight and size, it's this social perception and constructs that we put on it, and the values that we place on what somebody's size is and what they look like. Um, Go
Yeah,
ahead.
well, and with the kind of reclaiming of the word
Yeah.
fat as just, the kind of conversation that always makes me think of is when someone's saying, "Oh, I'm fat," and then the other
Mhm.
person says, "But you're so pretty."
But you right, but
And it's
both
like, I didn't say.
right. I
I didn't
didn't
say I
say I
wasn't
wasn't
pretty. I
pretty.
said I was fat.
Right. I said I was fat. Like, does both things can exist at the
Yeah.
same time, right? Like, I'm pretty and I'm fat. Like, there's nothing wrong with that, right? Like, and
Yes.
it's not, we don't have to try to dismiss it or say, like, equate it to something, right? Like, my size it doesn't have anything to do with, how pretty I am or how professional I am or
Hmm.
anything like that. And I think, one of the studies that I did with one of my students, we called it the fat tax. And we were really looking at self perceptions of fat individuals, professionals specifically. And so we were looking at how does others' perceptions of them, of us, impact how we understand ourself and our own self worth, sense of
Mm.
shame, and things like that. And a lot of the things that we found that came up were that often feeling overlooked, underappreciated, not getting promotions, feeling like people think of them as less professional, and less competent, and it comes in lots of forms. But feeling like I didn't get this promotion because they thought that I was fat, and there are definitely certain industries that tend to have more fat phobia than other industries do, and we see that come up so much more. But not only is that coming in the form of like professionalism, professional opportunities, and things like that, but we also see this weight and size bias in the ways in which our world is constructed too, right? And
Yeah.
our opportunities going, I was talking to my students the other day about just bias in general, different types of bias, and even my own privilege, right? That there are a lot of things that I have a lot of privilege on, and but one of the things that I think about all the time when I leave my house, if I'm going anywhere, the first thing that I think through my mind is like, am I gonna fit? Am I gonna
Oh.
fit in the chair? Is there gonna be something that is gonna be comfortable enough for me? We have like an auditorium and it's got the stadium seating, and I'm like, "Meh, are
Ugh.
these is this booty gonna fit in this chair? Am I gonna be flowing over, flying, right? Having to
Yeah.
get like, I have to get a belt extender most of the time, not all of the time, but even then, like I'm always like trying to like think skinny thoughts and like try not to be intruding on other people's space. And but that's one that is because the environment isn't set to accommodate people that are outside of whatever the ideal is, which is bonkers because the average woman in the United States is between a size 16 and 18, which is considered plus size.
Yeah.
But our world is not made for people that
Yeah.
are plus
Those
size.
should just be the size, and then the really small ones should be the minus size or
Right,
something, right?
right. Or,
Because they're less than average.
yeah, and things are changing in when it comes to accessibility of like clothing and things like that. And to call out my own, again, privilege is that I'm what some folks would call Lane Bryant fat, right? And so Lindy West is somebody who uses that term a lot, and there are others who use that term. But really, what that means is that most plus size clothing stores carry my size. I'm a size 22, 22, 24, sometimes down to a 20, but that's like a rare occasion. And so that's like right in the middle of the plus size kind of
Range.
spectrum
Yeah.
range. Yeah, it's usually 14 or 16 to about a 28. And so I'm right in the middle of that. And so I have the privilege of going into at least a plus size store like Lane Bryant and being able to find something for myself. We're also seeing a lot of stores like Old Navy and other brands that are being size inclusive. And I will just never forget when I went into Old Navy for the first time after they started their Everybody campaign. And I actually was really overwhelmed because it was the first time I went into a store, like a quote unquote normal size, straight size store. And I looked around and I was like, I can get anything here.
Oh,
Like
wow.
they will make it in my size. Like I said, it was a little overwhelming actually at first, and it took me a while. I don't even know that I left with anything that day because it was a lot to take
Choice
in.
paralysis.
Yeah, it was a lot to take in. It was incredibly exciting, and also I just wasn't used to it. I'm used to having a very small section in the back of the store that's like, very small little select pieces that go up into my size. And so there are changes. There are changes that are happening, but overall, it's still, again, the world is still not made for us environmentally. Seats are not made for us. Spaces, I'll never forget a time that we went to we were actually on a cruise with my family, and we went to one of the shows on board. And, most of my family is occupy larger bodies. We're all big folks. I'm Black and Italian, so I'm like, I won the genetic lottery for
Best
all
booty.
all the juiciness. And so we went to the theater and we sat down and they had arms, which anytime that there's arms, so it's always something that
Yeah.
is concerning. And we
It's always
sat,
a choice of maximum width.
right.
Like just mathematically.
Exactly. And we were sitting there and the chair just broke. And it was like, it was theater seating. So it wasn't even like a standalone chair. It was like the sides of the chair just kind of like busted off. And it was just so embarrassing. And so I just think about that again when it comes to our environment is just not made for us. And not only like things like seats and things like that, but also weight limits, like activities, things like that. Like I've always wanted to do the where you go and they do the faux skydiving thing, and like you go in there and it's like the air pushes up. You know what I'm talking about? I'm looking at the producer, right? Like, do you know what I'm talking about? Like I fly. I think that's what it's called.
Oh.
And like you go and you put the jumpsuit on and then like just and you're like in a wind tunnel. Yeah, you're like in a wind tunnel and you're like fly, right? And I was like, that's the closest thing that I would get to like skydiving because I don't think I'm gonna go actual skydiving. But there's a weight limit, right? Like there's a size limit to things like that. There's a size limit, even like some of the things that I love to do the most, which is like going to Disney, right? I love Disney. I am a Disney adult. And even going to Disneyland, while they are probably one of the most accommodating spaces. They do a really good job overall. There are a lot of rides that you can ride. And there are still ones that I can't fit, right?
Oh.
And that is hard. And it's those times that you, as a fat person, recognizing like, the world was not made. I was gonna say I'm not made for this world, like this space in the world, but it's the other way around. Like these spaces are created not with me in mind, which means that I feel it's very easy to feel ostracized, isolated, left out, and not thought of. And it really, I think, ends up putting folks fat-bodied folks into positions where they don't do as much. And then we have these perceptions of people, like the movie The Whale, which got a lot of really great acclaim, and I didn't see it. However, there are a lot of folks that talked about like this is like a skinny person's perception of a fat person, right?
Oh no,
Which is
I
that
haven't seen it
yeah,
either.
it's that, fat people just kind of sit in the home and they eat and they binge and they don't do anything but like self-loathe. And that's really not the case. And also, the world isn't set up for us to be able to go out and do all of the things that we want to either. And so, anyway, yeah, there's so many spaces where that bias comes out, and the fat phobia, even in industries and our organizations and professions, that make it hard for us even to move up in the world. We even see it in what's promoted, right? Like politicians, even those that are overweight or fat, have lower ratings than others. That we see a very specific ideal of what is competent, what is beautiful, what is professional. And anytime that we often see fat characters, even in media or in other spaces, they are the comedic sidekick.
Yeah.
They are
Sassy best friend.
they're sassy best friends. They are the comic relief. They're the villain, or they're there for the sake of kind of dismissing. They're dismissed, right? And they're rarely, very rarely ever the main character.
The narratives, make a character fat because they
Right.
don't want it to be a potential that, the male love interest might go for the fat
Right,
friend.
right.
So it's fat because it's like, well, obviously
Then
that doesn't create that complication in the
Exactly.
plot of the movie where we
Exactly.
just want his attention to be on the one female character.
Exactly. Which then, just like when it comes to like other internalized biases, like anti-blackness or anything else of internalized perceptions, we see the same thing for fat folks too, right? So long did I just didn't date. I wouldn't go out because I'm like, well, I'm fat. When I lose weight, then somebody will find me attractive. Like I was like, I'm not ugly. Like I'm cute and I'm charming.
All our video watchers know how adorbs and sexy and beautiful you are.
Thank you. But like for the longest time, like that, none of that mattered. And I never even like would internalize those things because I was fat. And so if I'm fat, then none of those other qualities can also exist. And so again, we see this in so many spaces and all of that, but also in healthcare and how we're taking care of ourselves and what's expected of us as well.
Awesome. Well, the mentioning healthcare actually is making me think of the stories I know you want to share, which
Yeah.
relate to that. But I think you had a book to recommend.
Yes.
During this section, because we try to keep our recommendation at the end to be that joyful thing. But this book is maybe more thoughtful and
Yes.
about a bit about doing work, which
Yeah.
also important.
Yes.
Just not what we end on.
Right. There's so many things, but the
So-
book is called The Body is Not an Apology by Sonia Renee Taylor. I have read it over several times. And it is not just about weight and size bias, but really taking the idea of what is body, because we have this movement around body acceptance and things like that, body positivity, which are all good. But what she really talks about is radical self-love.
Oh.
And this idea that like, it's not just like accepting my body, but it's looking at beyond weight. It's looking at ability. It's looking at different things and recognizing that our systems are the ones that are flawed, that are giving us these messages that make us want to hate our body, that make us want to not be in love with ourselves and our body. And so she talks about this idea of radical love. And I'm going to probably pull up a couple of quotes when we talk about some things moving forward, but straight from this book, she's incredible. And so definitely recommend reading that. She's got a workbook that goes along with it. And it is revolutionary. It's really transformative is
Oh,
probably.
sounds
And
wonderful.
Glennon Doyle has a podcast called We Can Do Hard Things, and she interviews her. And one of the things she says is like, the cover is as Sonia Renee Taylor, who is also a fat Black woman, and she's like naked on the cover. She's got like some, strategically placed flowers and things like that, but really allowing her whole body to be on display without shame, without feeling like you need to cover it up. And Glennon Doyle just talks about like, I am just confronted by this image, not because of you or your body, but the beauty of how much you own and love yourself, and how much what does it mean for me to do that?
Well, and without me having read the book yet, from the sound of it, like all those messages and this idea of radical self-love,
Yeah.
sounds like it would be a positive thing for many people, regardless
Absolutely.
of their relationship with their body.
Absolutely.
Other aspects of yourself and loving yourself,
Right.
if this kind of philosophy might help with that as well.
Absolutely.
Oh.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. Well, it's been great. We're gonna go to break now,
Great.
take a little rest, then we'll come back with some story time.
Awesome.
Thanks everyone, and
Yeah.
we'll be back in just a moment.
All right.
All right, welcome back to Diverse Joy after the break, everyone. So on the break, we just had a quick discussion. We wanted to, remind all the listeners that what we're doing here is not about tokenism.
Right.
All fat people everywhere did not elect Amber to speak on their behalf.
As much as I want to be the spokesperson.
Now, of course, Amber also brought in research, which reflects a more representative population and sharing opinions with others. But with everything on the show, when we're talking about our experiences or these experiences, we're speaking for ourselves. And never put the pressure of speaking for a whole community on
Yes.
any one member of that community.
Absolutely.
And we just want to acknowledge that and make sure that we're always standing up for that.
Absolutely.
So now we're going to go into story time,
Yes.
continuing sharing some of Amber's experiences.
Yeah.
So we always try to do a more difficult or negative story where maybe things didn't go in an ideal way. And then we follow it up with a more positive story, because we're always looking for the end goal with this podcast to be uplifting, to be joyful, to remember there are good and better ways to do things, even when we sometimes talk about difficult topics.
Absolutely.
So Amber, I believe you have two stories.
Yeah. So we kind of ended on talking a little bit, like I mentioned healthcare. And so my first story was I went to this doctor because I had a cyst, I had a lump on my wrist, which I get every so often, just under the skin. Usually it's just like a buildup of fluid and it comes into this like little like bump on my wrist. And so I went to the doctor and just said, hey, I think I have a bursa cyst. I think that's what this is, but I just wanted to, it's taking a long time for it to go away. I just want to get it checked out. Again, I've had them before. This was just happened to be the first provider that was available. So I just made the appointment. It wasn't like the person I typically see. And she proceeded to ask me my whole history, specifically asked me what my weight journey was. And I thought that was a very interesting question. No, if I was establishing care, like it makes sense. But this was just again, a one-off like appointment for my wrist, which I had established when I went in there. And so she asked me my weight journey, and at the end, and I was trying to give her context and more history about this lump. And at the end, she just said, "Okay, so I think you need bariatric surgery." And I said,
"Wait, what?" That's kind of jump.
Wait, first of all, wait, what? I was so taken aback because I obviously wasn't there for anything that had anything to do with my weight, right?
And for the listeners, bariatric surgery is
it's probably the most invasive form of weight loss surgery.
Okay.
And so there are many levels and different styles, like the sleeve and bypass kind of shrinks your stomach down to a very, very small size and kind of cuts that off so that you can't you won't absorb as much, so that you can
Oh,
lose a lot of weight. Now, people lose hundreds of pounds on it, and it's also life saving and necessary for folks, and also like again. She didn't ask me if I was trying to lose weight, if
oh,
I didn't have any health conditions that needed to be addressed by weight, and I also wasn't there for it. And so it was interesting because I have a cousin who used to call it the broken finger syndrome, and which is like he's a person of size, and he would go to the doctor, and every single time it was about his weight, even if he went in for a broken finger. That was
yeah.
like if I was thinner, didn't doesn't necessarily mean I wouldn't break my finger,
Oh,
right?
when you said broken finger syndrome,
Hmm.
I thought of the joke where the guy, it hurts when I touch here, and it hurts when I touch here, and it
Oh.
hurts when I touch here, and the doctor's like, yeah, that's because you have a broken
You have a broken
finger.
finger. No, no,
But I don't know.
no.
Okay,
More,
now I have a
more
new
that,
association with that. All right.
more that like I go in for a broken finger and all of a sudden it's about my weight, right?
Yeah.
And that's exactly what happened to me.
Yeah. Well, and I'm so sorry. It sounds like this doctor kind of took a look at you
Yeah,
based on appearance, was like,
yeah.
oh,
She needs to
let's
address
go all the way to
this.
bariatric surgery.
Yeah,
Let's like that just seems like ugh, such a
right.
jump.
And even if it was something that like I had to address or for whatever reason, there are lots of steps to take before going to a conversation about bariatric surgery, let
Yeah.
alone on the very first time you meet them. So, um,
Mm.
I think again it was, and I even remember her saying like people should be thin, and I was like,
What?
okay. And so, and I'm not saying that every doctor or every person in the medical
course
system
not.
feels this way. This was just my experience with this particular practitioner. And I hear lots of fat bodied folks that don't like going to the doctor because they're concerned
Absolutely.
that it will be a broken finger syndrome.
And also, I mean, being too thin or being thin. Sorry, we had
Sorry,
a
we
little,
got
we
our
had a
little
little dog
doggos.
squeak. Being thin or too thin
Right.
also has lots of health problems associated with it,
Absolutely.
and especially historically
Right.
was a big problem.
Right. And it's also, again, there's a misperception that if you're thin, then you're healthy.
Yeah.
Um,
And so I don't know exactly where I define myself now, but for much of my life I was very thin and probably not very healthy.
right. And like, again, it just perpetuates socially and from lots of spaces to do things that aren't healthy to maintain the specific body weight too. So yeah, I think that is a not an uncommon, unfortunately, experience in the medical system, whether it manifests exactly like that or not.
Yeah.
But there are times where it can be positive. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And I think my current physician, it was probably the most positive experience I ever had because I was like, all
Aw.
right, I'm establishing care. I have to like get my head ready to like answer all the questions about my weight and like
Pull on the armor for the battlefield of having this conversation.
Yes, and having to do the whole thing and I've always been very like comfortable in my body and my size. I've always been plus size and but having it can be very triggering going to the doctor and then like having every
Yeah.
single thing point back to that. So I was gearing myself up for it and she had a very positive approach and really took a health at every size perspective, which is growing in the medical community, which is lovely. But really how she talked about it was like, okay, I do have to ask about weight, but I ask every single one of my patients about, how they feel about their weight, what they do to maintain activity and their diet. And she said, and when I say diet, I don't mean like dieting and just like, what do you eat? And so she did such a beautiful job of, first of all, just normalizing it. Like, I'm not only asking you about your weight. She just said, like, I just want to know what your activity level, what do you do every day? What kinds of foods do you eat? So she normalized it, made it very benign. And then when we talked about like, my plans moving forward, it wasn't about weight loss. Even though I technically fall in like an obesity, category in my BMI, which is a whole other thing. And when we
Yeah.
talk about bias in the healthcare system, BMIs and things like that are not meant for everybody and they're faulty and
Yeah.
don't work. But she talked about like, okay, like let's just what are your goals? And like, let's make some goals towards that. And I was like, I just care about being healthy. And she's like, that's all I want for you too. And talked about like, okay, well, what do you want? And she's like, and I was like, well, I don't know. I was thinking about just walking. She's like, great. Next time I see you, like, have make sure you've taken some walks, like,
Oh.
okay. And like every time I go in, even if I've lost like a pound or I've maintained or anything like that, she doesn't, one, overly focus on my weight. And second, when I have made any minor success, she overpraises me. And as a behaviorist, as a clinical psychologist, I'm like, oh, right, praise works. Like that does feel really good. It feels good to like have you praise like my small progresses and not like progress and not shame me for having only lost a pound in 3 months or having not lost any weight. But she praises that like I care about my health overall, and not overly focus on the weight. And it has been and continues to be one of the most positive experiences I have in the medical
Well,
system.
that's good.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you had the counterpoint to that
Yeah.
bad story. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, awesome.
Mhm.
Well, thank you for sharing as
Yeah.
always.
Absolutely.
So our next segment is the audience question,
Yeah.
and the way we're doing this, we have a battery of questions, and we
Right.
try to kind of pick from them. If there's one that happens to fit the theme of the episode, go for that.
Right.
And that's what we've done today. And I want to encourage anyone listening,
Yes.
if you have questions or ideas or things that you wonder about that you'd like to hear us talk about, please go to diversejoy.com and you can submit comments and questions there, and we'd love to hear that.
We'd love to hear from you.
Now this one is a little bit of an amalgamation from something that I've actually overheard people say and talk about. So when things like body positivity movements come up,
Right.
or all bodies and so on, people say things like, well, I want to be supportive of bigger folks. I like this whole idea of body positivity, but isn't being overweight bad for your health?
Right.
Like, I always get stopped by that. Like, aren't you just supporting someone in being unhealthy?
Right.
And that is a question I have definitely heard,
Yes.
in my experience giving bias trainings, and then people asking like, well, is weight bias really bad?
Right.
Because isn't being overweight unhealthy?
Right.
So isn't that the same as having a bias against like smoking
Right.
or what have you?
Yeah.
And you have thoughts.
I have lots of thoughts. First of all, what's underlying that assumption is that like somebody who's overweight is not healthy. And it's not actually true, right?
Yeah.
Like health. And so the movement, first of all, is moving towards this idea of health at every size. And the other part of that is that like, when somebody says, well, but you need to be healthy, the underlying assumption again is that like, well, you're fat, therefore you can't be healthy. And there's a value in that. The value is valuing thinness, right? It's still centering what ideal body looks like and should look like. And
the correlation between weight and health isn't
Right.
what people tend to think it is.
Absolutely. Again, when I
The
talk
medical
about
research, yeah.
when we talk about the arbitrary like designations of obesity and whatnot are based on BMI, which isn't necessarily something that is well decolonized and centered that can work for everybody and every body type, but it's used in that way. It's used as a designation, and we see that it's faulty. It doesn't work for everyone. And actually, I'm going to pull up this quote from Sonia Renee Taylor. Body is not an
Hey.
apology, and I come back to this often. And she says, there is no standard of health that is achievable for all bodies. Our belief that there should be anchors the systemic oppression of ableism and reinforces the notion that people with illness and disabilities have defective bodies rather than different bodies. Equally damaging is our insistence that all bodies should be healthy. Healthy is not a state we owe the world. We are not less valuable, worthy, or lovable because we are not healthy. Lastly, There is no standard of health that is actually achievable by all bodies. And that's what I come to, right? Is like it's not it's not something that everybody can achieve. Just because somebody's body is different, whether that be from an ability standpoint or a size standpoint, doesn't mean that they're not healthy either. And how can we rethink what that means? And so the medical system is, like I said, and moving even away from the idea of like body positivity or body acceptance, but again, recognizing that there's health at every size. And the biggest tenets of that is like looking at that there's natural diversity in body shape and size, that there's ineffectiveness, and that it acknowledges the ineffectiveness and dangers of dieting for weight loss. Again, when we have this over perception on size and weight, then we are reinforcing the need to do crash diets and use things that are not healthy for you long term to maintain some ideal body weight. It emphasizes the importance of like relaxed eating in response to our own internal cues, right? Rather than a schedule or kind of this externalized way of eating. And it also acknowledges the critical contribution of our social, emotional, and spiritual self, as well as physical and health happiness, which I think is just, again, it's such a holistic way of understanding weight and size and health that doesn't only center, well, you're at this BMI, therefore you must do whatever you need to decrease. Rather, it's saying, let's take your whole self into consideration and find things that are going to be sustainable for you so that you can have a healthy life, not a skinny life.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah. I like that very much.
Yeah. So health at every size is, there's lots of we can link maybe some of the new
Definitely.
research and articles on health at every size that's coming out in the medical journals. But yeah, I think
great.
that's the way that I like to think about it, rather than saying, oh, well, you're fat, therefore it's unhealthy, and therefore I can't support you being fat, right?
Yeah.
Because it's like smoking. It's not
Yeah.
the same.
Awesome. Perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Now I'm going to share one of those habit breaking skills.
Sorry, I didn't throw back to you.
No,
What
it's all
is
right.
our habit breaking skill today?
Today we're going to talk about one of those kind of bias concepts. This is one of the things that is what keeps maintaining bias in our minds, in our cognitive systems over time. So, we talk about biases as habits of mind. That's part of the core of this whole idea of the bias habit breaking training. And one of the things about habits is that we have the habits because our brain has figured out that it thinks it has a good way of doing something.
Right.
It's been reinforced over many times, and so it becomes more and more efficient.
Right.
And our brains really like efficiency, and they want to maintain efficiency that they've achieved.
Yep.
And so when external information kind of challenges that, so some of the efficiency we're talking about here is, say, a stereotype. We think that's an efficient way to perceive someone. When that gets challenged, your brain kind of doesn't want to have to deal with that information. And it wants to maintain the habit it already has in place. And there are a number of ways that your brain kind of avoids having to incorporate new information or give it its proper due. But one of those is our concept for today, our skill for today, which is called confirmation bias.
Right.
Something many of you listeners and viewers have maybe heard of before. It's something that people talk about colloquially a lot. But in terms of how we're going to talk about it, so this is specifically about how we weigh different forms of information. And so when you have a pre-existing expectation, pre-existing notion, like a stereotype,
Right.
When you get new information, your brain doesn't always balance different kinds of evidence equally.
Right.
Well, let's say that overweight people are unhealthy.
Unhealthy. Yeah.
So that let's call that the stereotype, that if you're overweight, that means you're unhealthy. Well,
Right.
as you go throughout the world, there are going to be some overweight people who are unhealthy.
Unhealthy. Yeah. Absolutely.
When you encounter a person like that, that's a piece of confirmatory evidence.
Right.
It matches this expectation, this
Right.
stereotype. But you're also going to encounter some overweight people who are very healthy.
Right.
And that's a piece of disconfirmatory
Yeah.
evidence. It doesn't accord with the stereotypical habit of mind.
Right.
And what ends up happening, ideally for every one overweight person who is healthy and one overweight person who is unhealthy, those are equal pieces of evidence,
Right.
you know? But the way your brain actually stores and remembers that evidence, it
Right.
weighs the confirmatory evidence more heavily.
Right.
This is something my research lab has studied a lot.
Yeah.
And in some of our research studies, we can kind of translate it to a mathematical ratio.
Wow.
And that's a ratio of 3 to 1. So for every one overweight person who is unhealthy,
Yep.
it takes 3 healthy overweight people to balance out that one example,
Yes.
because your brain weighs them less heavily.
Right.
And hopefully my way of
Right,
talking
heavily.
about it, like the weighing and heavily,
Right,
doesn't get
right, right.
confusing with the weight example. I usually
Yeah.
talk about it with sexual orientation or
Yeah,
race
yeah,
stereotypes. But the point is, the way your brain gives attention to and holds on to that information is biased in favor of confirmatory evidence.
Absolutely.
And so what this means is, if we're going throughout a world where, as far as the actual people you're meeting,
Yep.
the stereotypes are not true.
Right.
They're just maybe arbitrary. So
Right.
like 50-50 chance that a given
Right.
stereotypic expectation will be upheld or disconfirmed.
Right.
You end up believing the stereotype more and more and more, because
Right.
your cognitive systems are holding more onto those confirmatory pieces of
Right.
evidence.
Right.
And this brings in why stuff like the recommendations we make at the end of each episode end up being so important, because
Yep.
if you're consuming media and having more
Yeah.
positive interactions with more people, more examples of people who counteract stereotypes, it's helping to work against this
Absolutely.
confirmation bias tendency.
Yeah. Well, and yeah, we've talked a lot about that. It's like how, I think one of the last episodes we talked about, I was talking about that self-assessment piece, right? And like recognizing where are some of the areas that maybe I have some reactions to, and intentionally going back to another past episode, but intentionally increasing my awareness and exposure to things that disconfirm maybe my bias, and things around weight and health, right? Like there's this woman, and I'm not going to remember her last name, but Jessamine, she does yoga for everybody, so like everybody, and she is a plus size yoga like master, and does inversions and everything, but it just again, it just confirms this idea that because you're fat you can't do yoga, you're not healthy, right?
Yeah.
And so yeah, absolutely, coming back to like all of our recommendations, one are ways to enjoy yourself, right? And increase joy, but also ways, and also not, but also find ways to, expand our experience and disconfirm the things that we more easily can confirm with confirmation bias. So yeah.
Yes.
Hey everyone, Amber here with a quick note. Later in this episode, you'll hear me recommend the Prime Video show called Watch Out for the Big Girls. It's a reality show that stars Lizzo in search of backup dancers. Now, since the recording of this episode, some of Lizzo's backup dancers have actually filed a lawsuit against her for harassment. And we've been keeping a close eye on what's happening and how that's progressing to decide whether or not to include that part of this episode. However, as of the release of this episode, motions are still being filed and it hasn't moved to court yet. So while we obviously stand with victims of harassment, with this episode being about weight bias specifically, we decided to keep that recommendation in because of the representation of body positivity and the celebration of big girls that it is. Now, on with the episode.
All right. So as always, to end every episode, we bring in some kind of recommendation, something that's bringing us joy that we think might also bring you, our listeners and viewers, a bit of joy, some joy we can share.
Yeah.
So you have a recommendation for today.
Yeah. And it's fun today. And we don't always have all parts of what we talk about, like kind of
on one theme.
But my recommendation today is totally on theme of like body, radical love and acceptance and body size. And that is Lizzo's Watch Out for the Big Girls.
Yay,
Yeah.
Lizzo!
Lizzo is queen.
Yeah.
I mean, I know, Beyonce is queen too, but Lizzo is my queen.
I feel like we're just cliche millennials,
I know.
because it's like, oh, Lizzo. Lizzo's goddess.
Oh my gosh, so
Ah.
good. I got to see her in concert recently, and it was amazing.
I hate you.
I was so good. It was so good.
Ah.
But yeah, Lizzo's Watch Out for the Big Girls. It's on Prime, and it is her like reality, like it's not game show, but a show where she is choosing her new backup dancers.
Ooh.
So she is one of the first like artists to like have like an all plus size backup dance crew. And she started off saying like, I really want like plus size, like I want big girls to be my backup dancers.
Yeah.
And I had a really hard time finding professional dancers that were plus size. So she started getting those that were a little bit more that were thickums, but she was like, I want big girls. And that's the name of her dance crew, or the Big Girls. And so it just goes through, she brings folks in, they audition, and then they go through a series where they have it's a competition series, right? And so they do competitions and different things, and folks get, kind of eliminated along the way. And then she chooses her final crew that they get to go to Bonnaroo with her. And many of them are like now on tour with her. And so like going to her concert and being able to see them, like
you get to see them on stage.
Yeah. You get to see them on stage. It's so cool. Like contestants like Jayla, shout out Jayla if you happen to be listening. I don't think you are, but if you are, that'd be so cool. And it's really cool to just like watch them after you've seen their whole journey. Yeah, definitely check it out, especially if you like
what's it
Lizzo.
called again?
It's called Lizzo's Watch Out for the Big Girls.
Watch Out for the Big Girls.
And it's streaming on Prime.
Streaming on Pride. Oh, yes. I've never seen it, but I'm
so
excited.
Good.
Anything
so
with
good.
Lizzo, I'm there.
Yes, it's amazing.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm Dr. William Cox.
And I'm Dr. Amber Nelson.
And produced by Eric Roman Binding, with music by Jay Arner. Diverse Joy is consumable as either an audio-only podcast or a video podcast, both accessible at diversejoy.com. Diverse Joy is the official podcast of Inequity Agents of Change, a nonprofit devoted to the dissemination of evidence-based approaches to reduce bias, create inclusion, promote equity, and enhance diversity. All that great Jedi work. Learn more at biashabit.com. Thanks for listening.
Bye. Perfect.
Awesome. How do you feel about it?
Good.
That's it.